The second book of Gleanings, chapter 2 and 3. These are just comments that I had. If you want to see them attached with the verses, there is other video. Verse 3:13 of book 1 talks of two moons. This passage refers to when the destroyer still slumbered in the upper vaults of heaven. It could refer to a second moon still being in its place. GLN 3:6, however, refers to people being wicked and warnings being ignored. That sounds like Noah's flood. GLN 3:7 talks of the floodgates in heaven, maybe a layer of water around the earth and an object, possibly the destruction of the second moon, piercing that boundary. Shinar was referred to earlier. I thought maybe Mesopotamia plain. And for GLN 3:9, 3:10, and 3:11, this seems to sound a bit like Moses bringing down the Ten Commandments. GLN 3:14 and 15 sounds again like Exodus, except here the spirit being was not angered and the chief interpreter was consoled and shown that even though they got the outcome they hoped for, it was an unnecessary sacrifice. Now, I'm going to go into chapter 4 and the analysis on the flood that it gives us. GLN 4:8 sounds a lot like what was talked about in chapter 3 when Aloma asked the woman what happened, and the woman says the men could not stand up to the men of the mountain. GLN 4:8 the people of the plain bowed before the strength of men of the mountains. They did not fight, for among all their possessions they regarded their lives as the most valuable thing, precious above all else. They said, "Take whatever we have, our riches and harvest, the treasured things from our dwellings, even our daughters for your amusement, but leave us enough that we may live under your shadow." The sturdy men of the mountains were sickened by these half-men who had lived for 3 generations without fighting, and they despised them. GLN 4:9 the battle-hardened men who had come down from the highlands took whatsoever they desired. The plainsmen demurred, but because their stomachs turned to water before the virility of their conquerors, their protestations were words of wind. The victors clothed themselves in plundered finery and indulged themselves in the wines and delicacies of the food tables. They slept in beds of luxury and dissipation, every want being attended to by the vanquished. They learned the ways of sensuality, which goes with soft living, and when sated with natural pleasures, some lightened their boredom with unnatural ones. The mountain men saw that the women of the cities were beautiful, but they were not modest, casting their charms before the masters unashamed. So it followed they were taken when required, and treated as chattels. The women did not complain, though hitherto they had stood equal with their menfolk, but women's equality with half-men is not something of value. GLN 4:10 with women like this, the men placed no restraint on their lust, and went from excess to excess. The women, rejoicing in the strength and vigor of the men, said among themselves, "Here are men indeed, such as we have not known before." Then in the manner of women, they turned away from their own men, and from the households of their husbands and fathers. For now they despised them. They threw off all womanly restraint, and grappled with the victors like ravening beasts. And the strong were vanquished by weakness. Always do women behave thus when their menfolk are defeated in battle. It is for this men fight. GLN 4:13 is reminiscent of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. It does not say the citizens offered to have sex with strangers, however. What it does say is the 3 men became angry at what they witnessed. It could easily be what the Bible says it could be, and then it could be many other things. Look at the description of what happened. That sounds a lot like what we heard after Nagasaki and Hiroshima after the nuclear fallout. And I want to put down an aside. The 3 from artists, they mentioned a mountain burst. While it could be like a cloud burst, I thought it could refer to a volcano after it blew off. GLN 4:13 one day from afar off came 3 men of artists, their country having been stricken by a mountain burst. They were worshippers of the one God, whose light shines within men, And when they had lived in the two cities for a number of days, they were stirred up in heart because of the things they saw. So they called upon their God to see these evil things. Their God sent down a curse upon the men of the cities, and there came a strange light and a smoky mist, which caught at the throats of men. All things became still and apprehensive. There were strange clouds in the skies, and the nights were hung with heaviness. Many days passed before a north wind came, and the skies cleared. But then, when women conceived, they bore devils. Monstrosities came forth from their wombs, whose faces were terrible and whose limbs were unproportioned. GLN 415. The Lady of the Night, I thought might be the moon, maybe even the second moon that's been talked about in prior chapters. The tresses of gold and copper I thought might be a tail of a meteor hitting the atmosphere, possibly the second moon having fractured and hit the earth, and the loud cry may be a sonic boom. GLN 415. The remnants of the sons of Nazira remained upon the mountains which are against Ardis, by the land about the encampment of Lamach. In Ardis there were wise men filled with the inner wisdom who read the book of heaven with understanding and knew the signs they saw, that the deeds of men in all the lands about the mountains had brought them to their hour. Then the day came when the Lady of the Night changed her garment for one of a different hue, and her form swept more swiftly across the skies. Her tresses streamed out behind in gold and copper, and she rode in a chariot of fire. The people in those days were a great multitude, and a loud cry ascended into heaven. What follows sounds to me a little bit like the Noah flood myth, however there are obvious differences. As follow, but this is a version of the Noah flood it sounds like, except there were a family of 14, and it included many other people, citizens from a town. Sesuda was the king. He did not build the ship, but he did pay for it. Hanok, I thought, sounded a little bit like Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah's story. Dwiven is actually the brother of Hanok, and it sounds like he fills the Noah story. Haggator could be the Abraham type from the Sodom and Gomorrah story. GLN 416. Then the wise men went to Sherapik, now called Sarapesh, and said to Sesuda, the king, Behold, the years are shortened, and the hour of trial draws nigh. The shadow of doom approaches this land because of its wickedness. Yet, because you have not mingled with the wicked, you are set apart, and shall not perish. This, so your seeds may be preserved. Then the king sent for Hanok, son of Haggator, and he came out of Ardis, for there he had heard a voice among the reeds, saying, Abandon your abode and possessions, for the hour of doom is at hand. Neither gold nor treasure can buy a reprieve. GLN 417. Then Hanok came into the cities and said to the governors, Behold, I would go down to the sea, and would therefore build a great ship, that I may take my people upon it. With me will go those who trouble you, and they will take the things which cause you concern. Therefore you will be left in peace to your own enjoyment. The governor said, Go down to the sea and build your ship, and it will be well, for you go with our blessing. But Hanok answered, It has been told to me in a dream that the ship should be built against the mountains, and the sea will come up to me. When he had gone away, they declared him mad. The people mocked him, calling him commander of the sea, but they did not hinder him, seeing gain in his undertaking. Therefore a great ship was laid down under the leadership of Hanok, son of Haggator, for Sesuda, king of Sarapesh, from whose treasury came payment for the building of the vessel. GLN 418. It was built on the lake of Namas, close by the river of gold, where it divides. All the household of Hanok was there, and the household of his brother, who directed the men at the task. Dwyven, captain of ships from the land beyond, Artis was overseer of the craftsmen. The women and children carried, and the men built. The length of the great ship was 300 cubits, and its breadth was 50 cubits, and it was finished off above by 1 cubit. It had 3 stories, which were built without a break. GLN 419. The lowermost was for the beasts and cattle, and their provender, and it was laid over with sand from the river. The middle one was for birds and fowls, for plants of every kind, that are good for men and beasts, and the uppermost one was for the people. Each story was divided in twain, so that there were 6 floors below and 1 above, and they were divided across with 7 partitions. In it were cisterns for water and storehouses for food, and it was built with escala wood, which water cannot rot or worms enter. It was pitched within and without, and the cisterns were lined. The planks were edged, and the joints made fast with hair and oil. Great stones were hung from ropes of plaited leather, and the ship was without mast or oars. There were no poles, and no openings, except for a hatch beneath the eaves above, whereby all things entered. The hatch was secured by great beams. GLN 420. Into the great ship they carried the seed of all living things. Grain was laid up in baskets, and many cattle and sheep were slain for meat, which was smoked by fire. They also took all kinds of beasts of the field and wild beasts, birds and fowls, all things that crawl, also gold and silver, metals and stones. Notice what comes next. They say the sons of Nazarah were with those who mocked the builders of the ark. The sons of Nazarah is mentioned earlier in chapter 4, where it talks about them coming from the mountain and attacking the city on the plain, and then they in turn become corrupted by the city on the plain. GLN 421. The people of the plains came up and camped about to see this wonder. Even the sons of Nazarah were among them, and they daily mocked the builders of the great ship. But these were not dismayed, and toiled harder at the task. They said to the mockers, "Have your hour, for ours will surely come." Okay, here is a breakdown of those that are said to have been taken on the ship and why. It says exactly what they knew how to do. And again, this is a much bigger group than just the family of the Noah flood. GLN 423. The king had entered, and with him those of his blood, in all 14. For it was forbidden that his household go into the ship. Of all the people who entered with him, 2 understood the ways of the sun and moon, and the ways of the year and the seasons, 1 the quarrying of stone, 1 the making of bricks, and 1 the making of axes and weapons, 1 the playing of the musical instruments, 1 bread, 1 the making of pottery, 1 the care of gardens, and 1 the carving of wood and stone, 1 the making of roofs, 1 the working of timbers, 1 the making of cheese and butter, 1 the growing of trees and plants, 1 the making of plows, 1 the weaving of cloth and making of dyes, and 1 the brewing of beer, 1 the felling and cutting of trees, 1 the making of chariots, 1 dancing, 1 the mysteries of the scribe, 1 the building of houses, and the working of leather. There was 1 skilled in the working of cedar and willow wood, and he was a hunter, 1 who knew the cunning of games and circus, and he was a watchman. There was an inspector of water and walls, a magistrate, and a captain of men. There were 3 servants of God. There was Hanok and his brother, and their households, and Dwyven, and 6 men who were strangers. In the next verse, it talks about the destroyer was newly released. And I'd like to mention that the second moon that was broken, the one that I mentioned on more than one occasion, might have been the reason what they were talking about. The beast with her, I thought might have been like an asteroid that maybe actually knocked the moon around, or maybe there were two huge pieces of the moon, and that there was a smaller one that followed the bigger piece. Verse 24 and 25 mentions that the stars were changing the location, which I thought could be the sudden removal of the delicate balance between the two moons, the sun, and the earth gravitational ways. After all, today the moon and the sun affect the earth by their pull, and in earlier chapters it says there was a second moon in the first book, but it was gone after the flood disaster. GLN 424. Then, with the dawning, men saw an awesome sight. There, riding on a great black rolling cloud, came the destroyer, newly released from the confines of the sky vaults, and she raged about the heavens, for it was her day of judgment. The beast with her opened its mouth and belched forth fire, hot stones, and a vile smoke. It covered the whole sky above, and the meeting place of earth, and heaven could no longer be seen. In the evening, the places of the stars were changed. They rolled across the sky to new stations. Then the floodwaters came. GLN 425. The floodgates of heaven were opened, and the foundations of earth were broken apart. The surrounding waters poured over the land and broke upon the mountains. The storehouses of the winds burst their bolts asunder, so storms and whirlwinds were loosed to hurl themselves upon the earth. In the seething waters and howling gales, all buildings were destroyed. Trees were uprooted and mountains cast down. There was a time of great heat, then came a time of bitter cold. The waves over the waters did not rise and fall, but seethed and swirled. There was an awful sound above. In 26, the pillars of heaven. That sounds to me like a pillar as a brace to support something. So I thought it could be the two moons that had, along with the earth and the sun, supported the structure of earth boundaries. It says they fell down to earth. It then says a new ruler appeared in heaven and swept across the sky in majesty. Maybe the surviving moon as the sole pillar that created the new balance. New in this case because if there were two huge parts that landed from the first moon, it might have been thought as both moons being destroyed. The skies were obscured after all. But when they cleared, the surviving moon might have pulled Earth closer to it, making it seem bigger than it was before. Being closer than the sun, its pull would have a pull that had been balanced by the second moon. But with it gone, the chaos would have caused a tug of war between the three remaining parts, the sun, the moon, and the earth. GLN 426. The pillars of heaven were broken and fell down to earth. The sky vault was rent and broken. The whole of creation was in chaos. The stars in the heavens were loosened from their places, so they dashed about in confusion. There was a revolt on high. A new ruler appeared there and swept across the sky in majesty. In 428 it says 7 days, but it wasn't 7 days of storms. But after the destruction in the sky cleared, it took just 7 days for some mountaintops to become visible. And GLN 429, it mentions the mountain is called Cardo, in mountain range of Ishtar against Nishim. GLN 428. The swelling waters swept up to the mountain tops and filled the valleys. They did not rise like water, poured into a bowl, but came in great, surging torrents. But when the tumult quietened, and the waters became still, they stood no more than 3 cubits above the earth. The destroyer passed away into the fastness of heaven, and the great flood remained 7 days, diminishing day by day, as the waters drained away to their places. Then the water spread out calmly, and the great ship drifted amid a brown scum and debris of all kinds. GLN 429. After many days, the great ship came to rest upon Cardo, in the mountains of Ashtar, against Nishim, in the land of God. I just want to make clear that I am self-taught. I have no college. In fact, I dropped out of school, so clearly the science I cannot speak to. However, assuming, which is what I'm doing, the texts are indeed ancient Egyptian, that clearly cannot be proved, by the way, then this is at least an interesting what if, and I love what if scenarios. It is why I find ancient history as far more interesting than after the Roman Empire, but it is a theoretical exercise and I offered it only as a possible translation of what the book says. Please do not feel I am attacking any religion beyond my own personal belief that the organized religion has caused more harm than good. How many times have they destroyed information because it contradicted what they believed? From Africa, Asia, and America, how much knowledge was lost because those in charge was unwilling to consider that while their own texts disagree, it does not mean it invalidates all the information in their own text. No, to me, society has suffered much damage due to the self-righteous leaders who were more worried about prestige and power. They would rather destroy anything they think is dangerous to them. However, that is not talking about the text, it is only talking about the actual organized religion, the ones that seem to think they can tell everybody else the way things were, even though they have no more knowledge than I do. Sorry, this is clearly a lot longer than I would have normally liked to have done one of these. However, please feel free to comment. This is my email address, and this is the Facebook page that I have for the audiobook. Thank you. Email is rustiace1968@outlook.com. Facebook page is at Project Audiobook Kolbrin Bible. Thank you, and feel free to make comments. Thank you.